Hello and welcome to One Giant Leap, a Neil Armstrong tribute. I'm Zia Tong.
And I'm Dan Riskin. Tonight we're celebrating the first man to ever step on the moon. Now the fame that came with that feat may not have been what Neil Armstrong was seeking, but that historic leap 43 years ago continues to inspire people all over the world.
With his passing, we've all been reminded of what an extraordinary human being he was. A risk-taking explorer and forward-thinking dreamer.
We were taking humankind where man has never been before.
Over the next 60 minutes, hear what it was like to be a true space pioneer from his Apollo 11 crewmate, Buzz Aldrin.
The liftoff was so gradual that all of a sudden we felt we were no longer attached to the ground.
And take an insider's tour of the museum in his Ohio hometown.
He actually got a pilot's license before he got his driver's license.
Meet the team bringing Neil's spacewalk into much sharper focus.
Before we restored this video, you could hardly tell there was a person there.
And look forward to a time when future missions might walk in his footsteps.
We have a lot of ground to cover in this poignant tribute to an extraordinary man.
So let's get things started by reliving those riveting moments of July 1969, moments that transformed Neil Armstrong from a test pilot to a household name.
We have a high confidence level that we'll fly the mission the way they are now detailed. I don't think that there's any question about what our job is. Our job is to fly the spacecraft as best as we can.
15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The liftoff was so gradual that all of a sudden we felt we were no longer attached to the ground. There was a little bit of swaying back and forth. The noise really wasn't as loud as we thought it might be.
Okay, engine stop. Tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
We were taking humankind where man has never been before. We were seeing things that had never been seen before with human eyes. And we were doing things that people have only dreamed of for eons and eons of years.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. And step off the lamp now.
I gotta believe when he was about ready to make that first step, he wanted to push the freeze button. Stop. I want to think about this. I'm going to stand on the moon here in a minute.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He really never did confide in Mike Collins or myself what he was going to say. I believe he said, well, I'll kind of wait till we successfully get there before I start giving that very much thought.
I can see the footprints of my boots and the treads in the fine sandy particles. There seems to be no difficulty in moving around as we suspected. It's even perhaps easier than the simulations of 160 that we performed on the ground.
I could see that he was moving around rather calmly and effortlessly. He didn't seem to have any difficulty maintaining balance.
Everything works so well, so surprisingly well.
I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the thing. That's all right, I don't mind a bit. How is the quality of the TV? Oh, it's beautiful, Mike, really is. They got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the one now.
The thing I remember most is the view of planet Earth from a great distance. Tiny, very shiny, blue and white, bright, beautiful, serene, and fragile.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made.
The president's words to us connected us back to Earth in a very direct way, even though we were further away than two human beings had ever been before.
For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
Just gazing at the Earth and realizing that there are millions of people back there except for three, and the three of us are somewhere else.
You're cleared for takeoff.
Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, engine on ascent. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
Apollo 11, reading a loud and clear. On position 1330, 6915.
It was certainly a magnificent tribute to the advancement of humanity to be able to leave our planet and get to that moon up there and then walk around on it. What a magnificent tribute to the ingenuity of humankind.
Wow, that is powerful stuff. Now, to say the Apollo 11 was a success, that would be an understatement.
That mission would cement Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins as true space pioneers. But the Apollo program itself would have a legacy that long outlived its final mission in 1972.
4 decades later, a shadow of the legendary Apollo program is seen on nearly all new space exploration.
It was a historical landmark. It was a bright, shining moment, and the echoes live on today.
Even though technology has changed dramatically since then.
There's more technology in your cell phone than I had in both my hands when I was landing on the moon.
Despite that, Apollo missions are still propelling space travel today. What's on deck? The Orion multi-purpose crew vehicle, and it looks pretty familiar. Although it's the most advanced space vehicle NASA has ever designed. Orion is meant to carry astronauts further into orbit than ever before.
Basic shape of the Apollo capsule, that so-called blunt body shape, is still being used. We're still using splashdown in the ocean as a way of recovering the vehicle. You have to go from something like 17,000 miles an hour to 0 in just a few minutes. So you've got to get rid of an enormous amount of energy in the form of heat. And physics says if you have a blunt surface, something that looks like the Apollo capsule, that's really the best way to do it.
Even the long-bodied service module taking Orion to space is similar to those used during Apollo.
Let's not start over. Let's use what we've got.
The Apollo program also sparked much of the technology we've grown dependent on today. From the beginnings of the microchip.
The Apollo era and the early space program pushed electronics to a frontier of becoming smaller, using less power, becoming more compact.
To protecting those on the front line.
Put Neil Armstrong or any astronaut on the moon, and since there's no air, one side is baking at 400 degrees, the other side in shadow is minus 200 degrees, and so the ability to maintain a human being safely there involved creating new materials, creating a cool suit.
Apollo astronauts were among the first to sample freeze-dried food, now a staple in military ready meals. Even our planet has been touched by the space program's legacy. Apollo also brought us this, the first iconic photo of Earth taken from the moon.
I like that photo. It's my favorite one. You see in the little thing there are 3 billion people, and then in the big thing there are 2 people. And
the era was filled with raw, conflicting images, but for a brief moment, all that changed as many saw the scope of our planet for the very first time.
Many people point to that picture as the beginnings, or certainly an icon of the environmental movement, where we really began to understand how fragile the Earth is and how tiny it is, where all of us live against the backdrop of the infinite universe.
Perhaps that will be one of the longest legacies of the Apollo program, its ability to inspire.
For a young person like myself, it gave me a lot of optimism about what we could do with our lives and with humanity.
I asked Houston if they were getting a picture, and they said yes, they were.
Tell me if you got a picture, Houston. Well, we got a beautiful picture, Neil.
And I was the most surprised. guy probably if everybody listened to that conversation, because I did not expect to get a picture.
Welcome back to One Giant Leap, a Neil Armstrong tribute. Now, as everyone knows, that first moonwalk on July 20th, 1969 was a massive feat of engineering. But beaming those iconic images live from the moon to TV screens around the world was just as historic.
Now, you might think you've seen it all before, but think again. The discovery of missing tapes from that day is bringing that 2.5-hour moonwalk into sharper focus than ever before.
A small step that had a giant reach.
We were watching this in the middle of the night on our little black and white TV set.
Neil, yes, we are getting a TV picture.
I was having trouble believing that this was possible in many ways because it was, from a technological point of view, it was a spectacular feat.
Dick Naftzger was front and center for that historic moment.
I was sitting in a control room at Houston when they turned that camera on. I was at the right place at the right time to participate in history. When they said, would you like to work at NASA and we'll double your salary from $4,000 to $8,000, I thought that was pretty exciting. When I got there and found out what I was doing, it was a little bit scary.
Scary because Dick was put in charge of broadcasting the Apollo missions to the world, an idea that almost didn't fly.
Television was not a priority of this mission, as most people know. It was getting to the moon and back safely. Once we got to the moon and they landed safely, all eyes turned towards television. As most people know, when you're looking at live TV, you only get one chance. And lo and behold, it was upside down, the picture, and we had installed a inverter switch. So we were quite concerned at the moment, but then I'll throw the switch in a second, and you'll see that the TV now is there. And what you're seeing is, degraded as it is, you'll see a Neil Armstrong coming down the stairs.
It was grainy and low quality to make it easy to send back to the Earth at the speed of light. Audiences around the world didn't seem to mind.
600 million in 1969 is an amazing number of people who are watching one television event. I think we high-fived and went out and had a beer.
At the same time, a feed of telemetry data was being sent from the moon to 3 ground stations. The data included information like astronauts' heart rate, status of the spacecraft, and the raw television broadcast.
That television from the moon was a format called slow scan, was not viewable by the public until we converted it.
The television feed went unnoticed because it was in an analog format, not normally used.
In 1969, we didn't have the digital world. We didn't have digital restoration. So that video was not prioritized.
No one noticed the video until 2006, when researchers in Australia noticed this photo taken 37 years earlier, when the data feed was coming in.
They said, oh my gosh, look how clear that is than the converted TV we saw live. And they contacted me and NASA and said, hey, we can look at digital restoration. So we had to look between Goddard records, site records, NASA records, hand searching through shipping orders to find things related to Apollo. Unfortunately, after 2 or 3 years of searching, we found that those tapes had been recertified.
The footage from the backup feed was lost. Still, Dick was a man on a mission to create a clearer picture of the lunar landing. He collected the best live broadcasts of the moonwalk and sent them off to Reliance MediaWorks in Burbank, California.
All of us are space buffs and absolute fans of the NASA program.
I play here, you can kind of get an idea of just how degraded the footage looked.
This was probably among the worst looking footage we work from. It involved us working with 5 to 10 times more complex math than we had ever used before.
They designed completely new software to take the footage from this to this.
The custom software that we wrote was meant to untangle the impacts of the camera, the impacts of the broadcast, the impacts of bouncing it around terrestrially on Earth, the impacts of the recording on tape, and what we know about how each of those affect image quality.
There was a very fine line, what to fix and what to leave alone.
In the case of the Apollo program, NASA said, absolutely not. We don't want to do any manual retouching. We want this true frame for frame to the original.
We want a historical document, not a touched up Hollywood film, because there's enough jokes about about the moon landing being faked anyway.
That small step for man needed a lot of help.
Neil's first step on the moon, one of the gain controls on the camera was set high, and so everything's all washed out. You can't see any of the detail of the suit.
Before we restored this video, you could hardly tell there was a person there.
We're very pleased with the degree of improvement that we made.
The video quality might not be perfect, but that doesn't change the moment shared by 600 million people.
What we have is a live television recorder from the moon. The history of that, it doesn't change.
Neil, yes, we are getting a TV picture.
Neil was a visionary. Neil was a dreamer, but he wasn't the kind of visionary or dreamer that just sat around looking at the clouds. He was the kind that knew that it acquired education, that it required experience, that it required training. He was the type of person who wanted to fulfill the dreams that he had. And that, I think, is a legacy for all of us. He wants us to dream big, to have very ambitious dreams, but also to prepare ourselves to make our dreams real.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
3 years before the heady success of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong was part of another ambitious mission to space. It's one that's long been eclipsed by his now famous moonwalk.
This earlier mission may not have had the moon in its sights, but it did have two firsts in space. One a major accomplishment, the other nearly fatal.
It was their first space flight, and the fearless pioneers were trained to expect the unexpected. Astronaut David Scott and Commander Neil Armstrong. The crew for Gemini 8. The main goal? Perform the first ever docking of two spacecraft in orbit. In March 1966, the first vehicle, the unmanned Agena, lifts off. About 2 hours later, the Gemini crew follows.
3, 2, 1, ignition.
Everything is going perfectly.
How's it looking, guys? It's looking good, bud. You have solid radar lock on with the Agena, over. We have solid radar lock.
Houston, this is Gemini 8. We're station keeping on the Agena at about 150 feet.
Okay, Gemini 8, you're looking good on the ground. Go ahead and dock.
Neil smoothly moves the nose of the Gemini toward the docking zone.
Boy, look at this.
Man, that's great.
It's a major milestone in space history.
And he's really smoothing. Oh, Roger. Hey, congratulations. This is real good.
But then, something goes wrong. They start rolling.
Well, we got serious problems here. What needs to be the problem? They're rolling up and we can't turn anything off.
The rolling gets violent, 1 revolution per second. There's a danger of blacking out, so they undock.
He says he is separated from the Agena and he's in a roll and he can't stop it.
A thruster is stuck open, continually firing.
Find out how much fuel he has used.
Roger. ACSQ, how much RCS have you used? Okay, we're down to 1,700 pounds right now.
Burning through fuel, he stabilizes with the hand controller and re-entry thrusters. But it means abort, now, or don't make it home.
Okay, relax, everything's okay.
10 hours after launch, Gemini safely splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. Despite an early end, thanks to Neil, the mission is a success, and tragedy was avoided.
During his life, Neil Armstrong received many accolades, but perhaps the recognition he most appreciated was from the people from his hometown in Ohio.
Now, Zaya got a behind-the-scenes tour of the Armstrong Air and Space Museum, which houses a collection of personal and professional memorabilia you're not going to find anywhere else.
Less than 2 months after his historic walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong returned home to a hero's welcome, complete with cheerleaders, marching band, and, of course, a parade.
What do you think of the turnout here for your homecoming? It's magnificent. It's far more than I deserve, I'm sure.
The small farming town of Wapakoneta, Ohio, saw its population grow from 9,000 residents to 50,000 screaming fans. all clamoring for a view of the astronaut or a piece of memorabilia.
Well, we were really inundated with news media literally from around the world. And it was pretty crazy. They had TV towers up, they had the antenna everywhere, and there was even people pulling grass out of their front yard to keep the souvenirs.
Despite the stardom, Neil Armstrong maintained his grounded hometown humility.
You're my people, and I'm proud to be one of you.
Neil's modesty never changed, and neither did his hometown. So that's where Neil Armstrong went to school?
That's where he went to school. That is the house that Neil Armstrong grew up.
Our tour guide is John Zwez. He lived around the corner from the Armstrongs and knew the family well.
Mr. Armstrong was probably one of the most intelligent individuals that I've ever had the chance to talk to.
Conversations with Neil were frequent because John served as manager for the Armstrong Air and Space Museum for 32 years. Well, this is a very special museum because you have objects and items from Neil Armstrong's childhood that don't exist anywhere else.
That's correct. The Armstrong family, his mother was kind enough to keep many of those items when Neil was learning about flight.
People had heard that he had built a wind tunnel to test model airplanes in his basement. You have a piece of that.
That's exactly correct, and that is the actual motor that he used as part of that wind tunnel to do that testing.
They even have Armstrong's first bicycle.
The significance of the bicycle here at the museum is the fact that he actually got a pilot's license before he got his driver's license. So he would ride this bicycle back and forth to the airport to learn how to fly. The plane that you see here, which is the Alanka Champion, is the plane that Neil Armstrong learned to fly in.
This is it?
This is the real deal.
The museum also obtained one of only 4 F-5D Skylancers that Neil flew as a test pilot. There's also military uniforms, a fraction of his awards, and one very historic spacecraft on loan from the Smithsonian. Now, John, if this is what I think it is, then this is what I have been most excited to see. This is the Gemini capsule.
It is. This is the Gemini spacecraft that Neil Armstrong and David Scott flew in back in the mid-1960s.
It is absolutely tiny.
Very tiny. Now, imagine that the astronauts not only ate, slept, but they had to go to the bathroom in there. And the thing is, there's no privacy, as you can see.
And this is what Neil wore.
The suit is made of Nomex, which is a fire-retardant material that nowadays firemen use. Of course, it has a helmet with it, and the gloves, if you'll notice on the fingertips, there are little flashlight bulbs. And when they turn the lights down low, they couldn't see all their instruments, so the little lights on the fingertips would light up and show them which instrument to flip.
Very good idea. Looks like we've got another spacesuit up here.
This is the backup Apollo 11 moon suit that Neil Armstrong wore during his training. The actual suit that he wore on the moon is in the Smithsonian because it still has a little bit of moon dust on it, and those folks get first choice.
Who needs moon dust when you have a rock?
This is the Apollo 11 moon rock that was brought back by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin back in 1969.
So, could you put a value to this?
You know, there's really no answer to that, and I suppose until we return to the moon, it's almost priceless.
Being such a humble man, how did Neil feel about having this Armstrong Air and Space Museum named in his honor?
Mr. Armstrong, I'm sure, was honored by that, but one of the big things that he really wanted to get across was the fact that it was just not him going to the moon. There was tens of thousands of people, the engineers, the technicians, all those people who worked so hard to put together the moon landing.
So, John, would you have counted Neil Armstrong as a personal friend?
Absolutely.
Wow, well, what a magnificent friend to have had, and we're really sorry for your loss.
I thank you.
Thank you very much.
It looks like a pretty special place.
It definitely is. You know, when the people of that town look up at the moon, they see it a little differently than the rest of us because they know their neighbor Neil left his footprints up there.
I love that he's actually able to bring home a piece of it with him. And get this, the samples he brought back are still being worked on today.
Only a handful of lucky scientists get to see them up close, and what's more amazing is those rocks are still revealing secrets.
Imagine going all the way to the moon and having a time crunch to get what you need before getting back. Neil Armstrong had just 15 minutes to gather lunar soil.
He had 15 minutes there to fill one rock box with an amazing assortment of samples. It's probably the best studied geologic sample ever. And there are still people working on it.
What took a quarter of an hour to collect has turned into half a century of work.
So there's 2 bright white ones.
These rocks are so important They're kept in a high-security facility at Johnson Space Center in Houston. Each sample is triple-bagged in Teflon, placed into stainless steel containers, and then stored in environmentally controlled cabinets. Ryan Ziegler is one of the gatekeepers.
So our first job here is to keep the samples as pristine as possible, that is, as close to what they were like on the moon as possible. First and foremost, we don't let them become exposed to air. The terrestrial atmosphere is full of oxygen and water, both of which are highly corrosive, and these samples formed in an environment free of water and oxygen, and so they would rust very rapidly if we were exposed to air.
When the astronauts first touched down, they and their rock samples went straight into quarantine. People were worried that they might carry pathogens from the moon. Once released, the lunar rocks ended up in the hands of scientists like Randy Korotev. He was a young student at the time and part of the team studying them at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
And all of a sudden, well, there was a wonderful opportunity. So I actually got to help analyze the Apollo 11 samples when they were first available.
It wasn't long before those precious samples revealed some of the moon's secrets.
There were people at the time of the lunar landings who thought the moon was just a big meteorite that had never undergone any kind of chemical processing.
Meaning it hadn't changed. But the lunar soil showed it did. The samples proved the moon was once molten and its crust formed over millennia.
The moon records on its surface early things that happened in the solar system that have been erased on Earth. Because we have plate tectonics and wind and water, a lot of the early geology has been erased.
As instruments get better, scientists are making new discoveries from the original Apollo collections. One of Randy's students has uncovered a surprise: granite.
On Earth, it takes water to make granite.
The lunar granite suggests there's more water on the moon than we ever thought.
The moon is not a completely anhydrous body, and that has wide-ranging implications for how it evolved.
Of the 48 pounds, nearly 22 kilograms of rocks Neil gathered, only 10% have been studied by these lucky few. Scientists who have all been hooked from first touch.
I still remember starting in grad school when I was 23 years old and getting to hold a piece of the moon, and it was amazing. It flabbergasted me at the time. I couldn't get over the fact that these came from 250,000 miles away and were collected by the astronauts on another planet.
Pieces of the moon that still have a lot to tell us about our origins. And it's all thanks to the Apollo astronauts and Neil Armstrong's first steps.
The samples that they spent so much effort to go and get are still being studied and are still of great interest to a great many people on this planet. Not just to scientists, but to the public at large. It's been 45 years, but people are still interested.
You can look at a picture of the Grand Canyon, and it's not the same as you stand on the North Rim and look at it, or the South Rim. It's just different when you're there. It's certainly more spectacular with the naked eye than it is with a picture. Some people said awesome, some said unbelievable. I just thought it was impressive.
Welcome back. From the moment Neil Armstrong stepped on the lunar surface, we've all thought of the moon a little bit differently. But how has our scientific understanding of it changed since then? As Ivan Semenuk reports, it's changed significantly.
We have a liftoff on Apollo 11.
Before the Apollo program, the moon was like a stranger in plain sight. Its familiar face hid a deep mystery. How is it that Earth came to have such a large and unusual companion? Some scientists once thought that the moon was a piece of the Earth that had broken away. Others argued that the Earth and the moon formed at the same time, like twins. Still others thought that the moon had escaped from another part of the solar system and was captured in Earth's gravity. But without a sample of the moon, no one knew which theory was correct. That's why it was so important for Neil Armstrong and the other Apollo astronauts to bring samples of the moon back. And those first bits of moon rock unleashed an avalanche of information, transforming our understanding of the moon's history. The biggest surprise, it turns out that none of the old theories about how the moon formed has held up. Concentrations of oxygen isotopes in the lunar samples show the moon is closely related to Earth. But the lack of iron and certain other elements show they are definitely not twins. So instead, a new theory emerged. Shortly after the Earth formed, it must have collided with another newborn planet. The impact was catastrophic, but Earth survived. The other planet was obliterated. Debris from the collision spun out into space, where some of it recombined to form the moon. This explains how the moon got its start, but no one knew what happened next. To learn more, scientists needed to study parts of the moon where Apollo astronauts didn't land, like the ancient lunar highlands or the moon's far side, places considered too dangerous for manned missions. So instead of astronauts, NASA sent Clementine. This unmanned orbiter was the first spacecraft to image the entire lunar surface. Even more exciting, Clementine revealed ice might be lurking at the bottoms of permanently shadowed craters at the moon's north and south poles. To investigate further, NASA sent the Lunar Prospector mission in 1998. Its job was to map the mineral composition of the lunar surface front and back. It also detected indirect signs of ice at the lunar poles. By 2009, the United States was anticipating a human return to the moon and sent its most sophisticated mission yet, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, to start scouting for landing sites. And the same rocket that carried LRO also launched a torpedo-like probe designed to do what Prospector could not, crash into the moon with enough force to prove the ice is really there. On October 9th, 2009, L-Cross succeeded with a bang. Today, LRO is still circling the moon gathering information. And now it has company. Two orbiters called the Grail mission are measuring the moon's gravity to find out what's under the surface, including whether the moon has an iron core left over from its violent beginnings. And the United States isn't the only nation interested in the moon. Back in the 1970s, 3 Soviet unmanned landers brought back samples too. In the last 10 years, the European Space Agency, China, Japan, India have all sent orbiting probes. But it's unclear if and when humans will land on the moon again. Many missions have been proposed, and there are many sites that scientists would love to investigate. 43 years after Neil Armstrong stepped off the lunar module, the moon is no longer a stranger, but it still beckons. The question is, who will answer its call?
Now, when you look up at the night sky, you might be wondering where exactly Neil Armstrong first stepped on the lunar surface.
Well, for those people who love to stare at the moon on a clear night like we do, we made this map up just for you. Here's a quick fly-in to the very spot Neil's boot made contact with the lunar surface in an area called the Sea of Tranquility.
One time I asked him about his almost fatality crash in the lunar lander training vehicle in Houston before his mission. And, you know, I mean, it was a pretty serious deal. The craft rolled, it crashed into the ground. You only see that he ejected at the very last second if you slow the tape down. So I asked him about it, and he just looked at me and grinned and said, "You know, Jim, some days are better than others."
Welcome back to One Giant Leap, a Neil Armstrong tribute. In a rare Australian interview, one thought to be his last, Neil Armstrong said he was sad the government's ambitions for the space program today are so much lower than they were in the 1960s.
He thought the original race to the moon inspired young people to do great things. Well, the good news is he did inspire people around the world, and now there's a race to get back to the moon.
The race to the moon is on again. Japan is planning a lunar lander set for launch by 2017. It's working on a rover that's along for the ride. The plan is to investigate moon rocks and the interior structure of the moon. Russia and India plan a joint mission to send 2 rovers to the lunar surface, possibly in 2016. Plagued by a series of failures, Russia's once mighty space program vows to send a manned mission there by 2030. Even the UK has thrown its hat in. Scientists plan to launch missile-like darts to the far side of the moon by 2014. Their goal? To study the lunar core and search for water. But China has the most momentum, launching 2 probes to the moon already. A 3rd is slated for next year. Are lunar footprints next?
China's kind of in the ascendant. It's still where America and Russia were in the early 1960s, so in that sense it's got a long way to go. But it's clearly got ambitions for future space exploration.
I understand that some believe that we should attempt a return to the surface of the moon first, as previously planned. But I just have to say, pretty bluntly here. We've been there before.
President Obama wants to send astronauts to explore a nearby asteroid, but NASA has not given up on the moon. One of the missions it's considering, called Resolve, would use a Canadian-designed rover to search for water near the moon's south pole.
There's an enormous amount of work to be done on the moon in terms of understanding it, its origin, its evolution, and its resources.
The big question is, are there enough resources on the moon to sustain a human colony?
The ice at the pole of the moon is water ice, methane, ammonia. So you can burn it, drink it, breathe it, power things with it, grow plants with it. A very worthy pursuit.
For the first time in history, companies and universities are competing with countries to land on the moon. There's even a contest called the Google Lunar X Prize.
Right now, we know of at least 2 ways of getting an economic return from the moon, and that's power either through helium-3 or through solar arrays. Someday, it's quite conceivable that we will have manufacturing on the moon and or in Earth-orbiting factories whose materials for processing come from the moon and were constructed from materials brought from the moon.
Could all this competition spur a brand new space race?
There is a possibility that a resurgent China may stimulate the United States or other countries to once again invest in an aggressive space exploration program in a competitive way, and this would be like a sort of Cold War rerun.
It is the competition that drove us to the moon in the 60s, and it is the competition that should drive us to the moon and beyond in the future.
Still to come. Neil Armstrong pushed human achievement beyond Earth. But are robots the future of space exploration?
Well, I think a couple of times during his post-Apollo career, he would be asked by reporters, would you want to go back to the moon, or would you want to, make a Mars landing? And he would always say something equivalent to, sign me up, I'll be there. I mean, he knew it wasn't a serious possibility. As soon as he got back from Apollo 11, within a few weeks, if not a few months, he knew that NASA was never going to fly him again. He was an American hero.
Welcome back. This past July, Neil Armstrong visited the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. He was there to commission the Discovery Channel telescope, the 5th largest in the U.S.
It would be his last public appearance, but it showed that at the age of 82, he was still very excited about space exploration way beyond the moon.
And it's what's beyond the moon that has scientists debating whether we should be sending astronauts or astrobots.
An incredible moment of robotic precision.
Touchdown confirmed. Receive online.
Decades before,
One small step for man.
this human achievement connected the world.
I think that captured the imagination of people young and old at that point in time. And believe it or not, it still does today. Because I hear from so many people, why did we quit? Why didn't we go on? And when are we going back?
I was rolling on the moon one day.
Captain Gene Cernan never thought he'd remain the last man on the moon.
I really believe we would be on our way to the moon by the turn of the century. I gave myself 28 years to be proven wrong. And, I'm not wrong. My timing was off a little bit. What's important today is not when we go, it's the direction we're headed.
That direction is being heavily focused on machines. NASA has 50 robotic missions on slate, with another 40 in development. And space agencies around the world are following suit.
I have a very robot-centric view of the universe.
Red Whitaker is working away on a lunar project in this prestigious shed at Carnegie Mellon.
Robots have great advantages because they can go where humans cannot, endure radiation, micrometeorite risks, the hot of day, the cold of night.
But there's value in risk. Human missions have brought so much science back, it's still being sifted.
I don't think there's any doubt that the strongest scientific legacy is the 382 kilograms of lunar materials that were brought back by the six successful Apollo landings.
Ian Crawford is a planetary scientist in the UK. He'd bet on humans over robots any day.
So just in terms of the distance covered, which gives some idea to exploration capability. The Apollo 17 astronauts achieved in 3 days what the robotic Opportunity rover has done on Mars in 9 years. And of course, poor old Opportunity has not and will never bring anything back from Mars.
Curiosity won't bring samples back either, but it will attempt to scale a 3-mile-high mountain. And Red's lunar rover will dive and drill into holes the size of football fields.
There is no plot afoot by robotics to displace people. It's just that robotics can pursue destinations that are inherently dangerous to humans.
Despite costing hundreds of times more, Ian says the human experience is invaluable.
And so you've got to look at the geopolitical reasons, the economic reasons, and human space exploration can contribute in these ways by stimulating technological and industrial innovation.
Touchdown confirmed. We're safe on Mars.
Still, moments like this suggest maybe things are on track, albeit later than some had hoped.
I tell you, those folks at JPL in California who were behind the Curiosity program landing, that was an incredible technological feat, and it will continue to be a precursor to human beings. But, you know, curiosity, using that word, curiosity is the essence of human existence. We want to know who we are, where we came from. Let's cross the mountain. Let's go around the corner. But let's find out if we're the only ones around or have been or might be.
In the future, a trip that might be possible for man and machine.
What I would like to have written on the back of Curiosity, you bet your life I would, and I'd do it if I could.
Space pioneers. Gotta love them. Well, it's hard to encapsulate the legacy of Neil Armstrong in 60 minutes, but it's clear that as extraordinary as his accomplishments were, in some ways he was just a dreamer from Ohio who happened to dream big.
In their own tribute to the man, his family made the following suggestion after his passing. The next time you walk outside on a clear night and see the moon smiling down at you, think of Neil and give him a wink. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Dan Riskin.
And I'm Zaya Tong. Good night.